Welcome to the Learning Can't Wait podcast, a Full Mind production. At Full Mind, our vision is to ensure every child has access to an exceptional education. Each episode, we will be joined by pathfinders within and around the education space who are bringing about transformational change on behalf of deserving students. I am your host, Hayley Spira Bauer. Welcome back to the Learning Can't Wait podcast, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here today with our next guest. We have Dana Ainsworth, the founder of Tomorrow House, joining us here on the podcast. And what has me particularly excited is both Dana's energy, which I've already felt like I'm calming my own body and soul down a little bit listening to her, but also her passion. I'm going to let you have her tell you all about it, but the topic we'll be discussing today is one that deeply impacts educators in community, and also is a huge part at the intersection of research and science and pedagogy. And without further ado, Dana, I'm thrilled to have you on today.
Great, Haley. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Dana, can you tell everybody how you came to be the personal and professional version of yourself, please?
Yeah, the short version, because the long version is very, very long. But I had a pretty tough childhood. I had attended about 8 different schools by the time I reached ninth grade, and I was expelled in ninth grade, which you know, really, I think shaped my life trajectory. I thought I was a bad kid. I thought I was a dumb student. I didn't go to college for 4 years after graduating. And then I kind of got out into the world and got a better perspective and eventually, went to college to become a teacher. And when I became a teacher, of course, I was drawn to work with students like me, and I found that there were literally no tools to help those students, and that those were the students who also were in a lot of trouble. And then, of course, I stumbled on the research around adverse childhood experiences and ADHD and all these behavioral outcomes in schools. And I was just hooked. I was like, okay, this is the path. And even when I was a teacher and I had that research in hand and I was taking it to school administrators, I was getting so much pushback. So I was like, how do I get a seat at this table where I can help shift the way administrators think about behavior in schools? And that is what propelled me to go on and get my PhD and has brought me here today. So,
It's so often on this podcast that we hear stories about one teacher who inspired someone to follow this path. And less often that we hear stories of people who had some of the experience that you've had, where you felt like you weren't smart and the path wasn't for you. And it was through your own process of self-discovery that you came to find your way and find what fueled you and what you felt was important in this world, which I totally agree with. And not everybody has the conditions around them that make that possible, which is what I think makes your work and your life's purpose even more important. Talk to us a little bit about Tomorrow House and, put a little bit more color into the picture of what you have built.
yeah. So, when I was in graduate school, I focused a lot on, different tools to help, support students that were struggling, and especially students who had a background in trauma. And adverse childhood experiences. And I looked at meditation a little bit. There's some of that happening in schools. I studied MTSS to an extensive degree, but I still felt like we just didn't have super practical tools that were easily implementable. And as a former high school teacher, I had the perspective to kind of sense what this could work and this couldn't work. There's so much theory in education, right? And just so much theory in academia that I encountered when I was a teacher that was just not at all applicable to the actual classroom. And so I really, really wanted to find practical tools that didn't require a teacher to completely relearn something and exhaust themselves trying to, implement in the classroom. And when I discovered polyvagal theory and nervous system regulation, I was like, this is it. I mean, this is so fundamental to how we operate. And just having an understanding of it can change how we function as teachers in the classroom and how we respond to behavior. So I really just wanted to build a vehicle to get this into schools as easily and readily as possible to make it to really lower the barrier to not have a massive grant or a whole refunding structure to get this in, but just to give teachers something that they could use right now. And so that's really been my approach to this work.
You've described what's happening with young people right now as a regulatory problem, not a discipline or a motivation issue. And that framing is really distinct. When you walk into a school and you're trying to help educators see through that lens, what's the biggest mindset shift you're asking them to make?
Yeah, so when we look at the history of how our schools were built, really the architecture is built around the idea of compliance. We had this kind of fundamental expectations that we could teach students to sit still in their chair all day long, and if they didn't, there were all these consequences in place. And we really, I mean, we've been working. We have the research. We've been working to kind of shift things, but just to fundamentally help teachers view behavior as communication, um, and understanding the regulatory process, what behaviors are within a student's control and capacity, and what are simply a part of the nervous system response to the environment and to their own history. So just helping get that understanding across, I think, it's a huge revelation. I see a light bulb go off when I introduce this to teachers. It's sort of like this aha moment of like, right, yes. So it's just moving the needle a little bit so that we're thinking about behavior as what is the student trying to say when they are behaving this way? What is really underneath this? What's really going on? And then giving them a really solid toolbox to respond to it.
It's impossible for me not to connect what you're talking about that happens in schools to what happens at homes for families and parents. And I think so often the struggles that teachers face, albeit with much larger populations in front of them, is often seen at home for families as well. Is that an area that you've explored extending this work to, helping parents, coach parents to identify that their kid is not bad, but like you say, there's either a skill lacking or there's a disposition that's needing to be filled or some message that's trying to be conveyed through behavior?
Yes, definitely. It's so funny because when I first started teaching this, doing these workshops, teachers would say to me, "Oh my gosh, this is going to completely change how I parent." And then I've had principals ask me to come in and do workshops for parents, which I think is a really great extension of this work. Schools can try to do this all day long, but if they're not getting that reciprocal support at home and that reciprocal understanding, then they're kind of working against an opposing force. So yes, definitely. I really love it when schools offer this workshop to parents and especially at the start of the school year, I think it can make a big difference. And I am starting to get more and more requests for parents, especially those with, who are new parents and navigating early childhood who are like, oh my gosh, like even when my child's learning to crawl, I can help them. That moment they're starting to shape their nervous system. So how can I help them regulate in those early moments? So yes, this is an area that I'm starting to branch into more and more.
Yeah, it's such a logical extension. And to your point, the cohesion between school and home is really powerful for students, especially students who are struggling, right? To have that kind of consistency across all their environments. So they know what to expect, which helps brains to regulate, helps children's to process. Um, just kind of switching gears for a second, your doctoral research traced the trauma to prison pipeline and the systemic policies that shape how we respond to student behavior. We're in a moment where a lot of federal and state policy churn around school discipline and mental health funding. We've seen a lot of churn on that. Where do you see the current policy landscape helping that work, and where is it getting in the way?
Yeah, whenever I talk about policy, I have to start with the historical elements that got us where we are today. And I think one of the most important things that I could ever share about policy is this fact that seems so unrelated, but is really very, fundamental to how we got to where we are with discipline in schools. In 1970, we had fewer than 200,000 incarcerated individuals between the federal and state prison populations. Within 30 years, by the year 2000, that number was at 1.3 million. Now, at that same time as we were building mass incarceration, we really shifted our discipline policies in schools as well. We moved toward exclusionary discipline. We moved to three strikes policies, zero tolerance policies, school resource officers. We saw a doubling of out of school suspensions in that 30-year period. So, in order to understand how to change where we are right now and how policy plays a role in where we are right now, we have to look at those historical elements and how we got here. There is a lot of talk around mental health. We see that our students are in crisis. We're trying to shift funding to do that, but it's sort of like now we're trying to, use a glass of water to put out a raging inferno, right? And we haven't looked at what started the fire to begin with and what those fundamental shifts need to be. And a lot of those policies that come out, they move with the political pendulum swing. So we make some momentum in in one area, and then it goes swings back all the way to the other. And it's very hard to make forward momentum when we're going side to side. So that's a piece that I see as fundamental to this work. And ultimately, I hope I really love participating in policy work, but we have to look at how the structures of our schools and our society shape behavior and are lending to this mental health crisis among our students. So it's not enough to just say, oh, here, let's, fund more school counselors. We have to look at how we have fundamentally structured our schools to support, the holistic development of a child. We have so much amazing research now around brain development, around character development, around how we come to be who we are through those, really critical years that we spend inside the school building. And there's such a gap between that research and how we're teaching our students and how they spend their times in the classroom every day. So I really would love to see education extracted from the political pendulum swing. And that's really become more acute in the last decade. How we do that work, I think there's still a lot of question around it, but I think we've got to start talking about, doing that on a state by state level and really helping pull schools away from that pendulum swing.
Yeah, the research to practice gap around the topics you're naming here is pretty significant. I think about the schools that have completely eliminated, music opportunities, arts opportunities in favor of, kill and drill test prep work for kids. I think about high schools that have really wrote policies around behavior and, like you said, expulsion and discipline practices that are not restorative in any sense when we have a huge body of research supporting the work required to help students cut down on recidivism in their, choices in classrooms and outside of classrooms. It is alarming while it also coincides with changes at the funding level from the federal and state government. But there's another topic that I think is also bringing a big question mark to mind right now, which is as the federal government pushes forward initiatives around artificial intelligence, encouraging states and localities to really embrace technology and momentum moving forward, we also have the pendulum swing of parents pushing back on technology in classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
From your perspective, how should we be thinking about the duality and dichotomy of, artificial intelligence and kind of emergent technologies while also allaying, thoughts and concerns that families may have about the usage of screens in schools today and how that impacts their students' mental health?
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing such backlash around ed tech right now. And naturally, we've got all this data coming in now that it really has reduced a lot of skills and abilities for students. So I think as we have AI coming in, we are at a really, really dangerous point of, students doing that cognitive offloading. And the way that I see this so fundamentally tied into nervous system regulation is that, we develop our ability to regulate through challenge. We develop that resilience, and we do it when we face challenge and learned how to keep ourselves calm and apply these tools, right? And when you remove challenge, we just don't develop those skills. So already we've seen a movement toward that in the past decade. You know, we've seen some overparenting. We've seen a lot of learned helplessness happen in schools because we've taken away the building blocks that of challenge that really help students build resilience. Now, adding into the AI piece where students can even, we know they're so forthright about it. You've got to hand them that. They tell us exactly what they're doing. You know, they're uploading their homework assignments to AI, they're having their essays written by AI. It's just so easy. I mean, the temptation, even for adults, it's high, it's strong. So why wouldn't we expect our students who are smart to take the easier route, right? So we have to really think about how we are developing classroom assignments and assessments in a way that allows students to demonstrate their skills, instead of just, turning in these assignments where they're just filling in the blanks and, answering the questions or writing the essay. And the data has shown us for years that that's something we need to do. We've seen such a decline in our national scores. We've seen a decline in our international standing because we're not instituting a lot of these models that we know work. And AI I think it just expedites that necessity of changing our classroom model, our model of learning and assessment. So they kind of go hand in hand, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think about us having students offload the cognitive load, as you say, and that coinciding with increasing mental health concerns and over reliance for students on AI chatbots as like partners, friends, all this. It paints a very bleak, concerning picture for the future. So, can you talk to us a little bit about the polyvagal theory and really what are some practical ways we can be thinking about implementing some of the ideas that you espouse when you're on the road and talking to partners? I love when we get to talk theoretical, but I also love when folks listening to this podcast get to walk away with some practical theories.
Mm.
And I know that no one better to ask this to than you.
Hmm. Yeah. So there was a lot in that question there. So let me like kind of back up a little. I think if you would just take the AI piece itself, the most pressing need that we have is for teachers to be redeveloping the classroom structure, which is it's a big ask right now when they are managing so many other things. But the amazing thing about AI is that it is an incredible tool for developing curriculum for students and lesson plans. So I would encourage teachers out there to utilize it in that capacity to help it rethink, how it can be introducing information and knowledge in ways that students are actually embodying that learning and making that a long-term learning, and demonstrating their skill set as they go. Um, I think I think it's not quite so easy to just pop out some answers to how you can be, regulating in the classroom, because I think one of the fundamental pieces to it is understanding what's happening in the regulation process and how the nervous system works. And so I really like to start there with teachers and because I think when we understand why students are behaving the way they're behaving, that alone can shift a lot about how we think and how we approach it. Um, but I think, just building in to the classroom day, if there's one takeaway I guess I could give everybody that's quick, it's just, the breath is such an incredible tool for regulating the nervous system. Just taking a few deep breaths. If you just do it right now, just take a deep breath, everyone listening, it can have such an impact on the pace that you're moving at. So if teachers can build that into the start of the day, for all of the elementary teachers who have the student the whole day, working that breath work in at the beginning and helping students arrive to a calm place. Just think of all the things that students arrive to the classroom with, right? They've been, getting out of bed early and their parents are rushing them around and they have to get dressed and get breakfast and catch the bus on time or walk or all of the things. It's high energy, it's rushing. And then add in whatever stressors are happening at home. Parents might be arguing or a single parent household where it's just one trying to get the child out. Like there's so much that they're carrying with them when they arrive to school. And we don't leave any buffer. We don't leave any room for them to separate that from their classroom experience. So if we think of how we feel at the end of a work day, and what happens when we just, drive home in rush hour traffic and then walk into the house to our families? We're usually like up here, right? We're like, right, like,
Mm.
ah. And I know a lot of people just sit in their car for a few minutes and just take a few breaths. And it's that little shift that completely changes how you enter, your home at the end of the day. So if we reverse that for students and really create space for them to separate, kind of leave all the stress of home life and rushing and getting there and help them start, just get into a place to start their school day. That is huge. That's so much. And it seems so little. 5 minutes can make such a difference. But there are a lot of other tools in the toolbox that, we could spend time on. I don't think we have enough time to get into much of it here today. But yeah, that's my one takeaway I'd say to focus on.
No, and I hope my question didn't make you feel like you could easily reduce the life's work that you've been preparing and helping schools to restructure with. And truthfully, at the end of the day, there are so many messages even that I've taken from the conversation we've had thus far that are really keynotes, such as understanding behavior as the priority, the first point, thinking about the systemic, the structures that our school day what it allows for and what it doesn't permit. And then, all the other components such as proper MTSS and the work that you're describing here. And I'm sure the list goes on and on and on. Can you maybe share a story with us of a time where you walked into a community that you've been working in or that you were new to and you felt really wowed by how they really considered all of these components in creating an environment supportive of students' mental health and well-being?
Oh gosh. I think the thing that I love to see is when I introduce this to teachers, it's when I was a teacher, every time we had a faculty meeting, it felt like there was one new thing that we had to be like doing or thinking about. And you're just so exhausted and burnt out as a teacher. And one thing I wanted to be really mindful of when I approached this work was to not give teachers one more thing that they had to master or learn or do. And so it's really refreshing to see when this is introduced to teachers, see this met with a sense of relief instead
Mm.
of a sense of panic of like, oh God, now I have to do, something else. I think teachers are really hungry for tools to help combat the mental health crisis that we're seeing right now among our young people. And the dysregulation, we've got an entire generation of kids whose developmental structure is being interrupted by digital technology. And teachers do not know what to do with that. And then you add in COVID, add in the pandemic that really, really heightened that dysregulation. And we saw students return to the classroom, swearing and hitting teachers and just being violent. And teachers have been so helpless to know how to respond to that. So I think, what I see and what brings me so much joy is when I hand this to teachers and I see that relief where they're like, okay, now I know why they're doing what they're doing. Now I understand why these kids are kind of off the rails right now. It makes sense, like all of these things. And now I know how to plug in these pieces to help combat that. It's a tool, right? It's not an obligation. It's not one more thing that I have pressure to be performative about. So yeah, that's a real I find that incredibly encouraging to just see that as a response among teachers.
Mm. And finally, I guess as we're parting ways today, I'll ask you my final question. If you were giving one piece of advice to a brand new teacher, what advice would you give them?
Yeah. I hate you might edit this out, but
No, I will
whenever
not
I
edit it
see
out. I want to hear your real take, Dana.
Whenever I encounter a young person who's considering a teaching degree, I really want to have a heart to heart with them to understand, okay, tell me why you're approaching this, like what it is you want to see, and to really help them have an honest understanding of what it is that they are up against. Because 5-year burnout is so real, right? We see our young teachers dropping out after such a short period of time. And I think having a realistic understanding of what they're up against helps them really prepare for that. When I was in my teacher education program, classroom management was like this tiny piece. And it was so theoretical. It really, to me, was not very practical. And then I got into student teaching and I was like, oh my God, what? Like, wait a minute, what am I supposed to do with this kid who's like getting up out of their seat and running around? So I would encourage every new teacher to really spend as much time on those behavioral aspects as you can, because the teaching knowledge, information piece, it's just a fraction of what you're doing in the classroom every day. And unfortunately, teacher training programs overlook that, or just I don't think that they fully prepare teachers for the whole developmental spectrum that they're going to be engaging with during their time in the classroom.
Yeah, I didn't learn what an ACE score was until probably year six, and I learned about it from my best friend who's an ACE researcher,
Right.
not not from the organization that prepared me to become a teacher in a high needs community that had been historically marginalized and systemically oppressed. So I agree with that statement, Dana. I feel like it should be a regular part of understanding and working with all kids, especially as pretty much the whole nation's ACE scores went up after COVID,
Yeah, it did.
as a collective, not to mention disproportionately children of color in this country. So I totally agree with you and feel like this was such a timely conversation, given just all the things happening in the world around us. And I'm really grateful for the reminder to breathe, but also for thinking more deeply about how our structures and systems can either detrimentally impact or holistically support students' well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Dana.
Thanks for having me, Haley. This has been great.
And thank you to everybody for tuning in today. Thanks for listening to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and share this episode. Be the first to know when we have a new episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or have a suggestion for an episode, email us at podcast@fullmindlearning.com.